Chapter 1. Diving into Deception. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the dive boat Sea Star as it cut through the calm waters off Key Largo, Florida. The date was September 15, 2019, and the weather conditions were perfect for what would become one of the most memorable dives in the area's history, though not for reasons anyone could have anticipated. Meredith Harris stood near the stern of the 40-foot vessel, methodically checking each piece of her diving equipment with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual over 1,000 times. At 37, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of professional diving instruction, her movements economical and purposeful as she tested her regulator's primary and secondary stages, examined the O-rings on her tank valve, and verified the readings on her dive computer. The boat rocked gently in the slight swell, and Meredith automatically adjusted her stance, her sea legs as natural as walking on dry land after 15 years of working these waters. She had started diving as a college student in marine biology, but the ocean had called to her more strongly than laboratory work, and she had built a successful career as a PADI Master scuba diver trainer, one of only a few hundred in the world to hold such credentials. Her husband Brandon moved around the deck with less assurance, still somewhat awkward in his movements despite having earned his advanced open water certification 2 years earlier, shortly after their wedding. At 41, he was a successful real estate developer from Miami who had taken up diving at Meredith's encouragement, though she sometimes wondered if his enthusiasm was genuine or simply another way to control aspects of her life that had previously been hers alone. Brandon's attention seemed divided between helping other divers with their equipment and watching his wife, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with admiration. There was something calculating in his observation, though the other passengers on the boat interpreted his attentiveness as the behavior of a devoted husband, concerned for his wife's safety in what he still considered a dangerous sport. The past 6 months had been increasingly difficult for their marriage, though Meredith had been careful not to let her personal troubles affect her professional demeanor. It had started with small discrepancies in their joint bank account, unexplained withdrawals that Brandon dismissed as business expenses. Then she had discovered the second mortgage he had taken out on their Miami Beach home without her knowledge, using forged documents that bore a reasonable facsimile of her signature. When confronted, Brandon had become defensive and then aggressive, accusing her of not trusting him and questioning his business acumen. He reminded her that his real estate investments had paid for their comfortable lifestyle, their vacation home in the Keys, and her expensive diving equipment. The argument had escalated until he stormed out of the house, returning 3 days later with flowers and apologies, claiming he had been under enormous stress from a difficult development project. But Meredith's suspicions had been aroused, and her subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of financial irregularities that painted a disturbing picture. Brandon had been borrowing heavily against their assets, taking out loans that she knew nothing about, and making wire transfers to offshore accounts that he claimed were related to international investment opportunities. Most troubling of all was the life insurance policy he had insisted she sign the previous year, a $2 million term policy that now seemed less like prudent financial planning and more like a motive for murder. The dive boat captain, Miguel Santos, had been running trips to the artificial reefs off Key Largo for over 20 years, and he knew these waters better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. Today's destination was the USCGC Duane, a 327-foot Coast Guard cutter that had been deliberately sunk in 1987 to create an artificial reef. Resting in 120 feet of water, the Duane had become one of the most popular wreck dives in the Florida Keys, its superstructure now home to an incredible variety of marine life. Carlos Mendez, the dive instructor from the local dive shop, gathered the 8 certified divers on the boat for the pre-dive briefing. Carlos was a veteran of thousands of dives, a former Navy diver who had transitioned to civilian instruction after his military service. His manner was professional but relaxed, conveying both the excitement of exploring an underwater world and the serious safety considerations that made such exploration possible. The briefing covered the dive plan in detail: a maximum depth of 120 feet, bottom time limited to 20 minutes to stay within no decompression limits, and mandatory safety stops at 15 feet for 3 minutes before surfacing. The current forecast showed minimal flow from the southeast, and underwater visibility was reported at an excellent 60 feet, with water temperature holding steady at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Carlos reviewed the emergency procedures, pointing out the locations of emergency oxygen and first aid equipment on the boat, and reminding everyone of the standard hand signals for underwater communication. He emphasized the buddy system, noting that each diver should maintain visual contact with their partner throughout the dive and be prepared to share air in case of equipment malfunction or emergency. Meredith listened to the briefing with half her attention, having heard similar presentations hundreds of times before. Her focus was on her equipment check, a process she never rushed despite her experience. She tested her regulator by taking several breaths, confirming that air flowed smoothly and consistently. Her submersible pressure gauge showed a full tank at 3,000 psi, and her dive computer displayed all normal readings after completing its self-diagnostic sequence. As she prepared to don her buoyancy control device, Brandon approached her with what appeared to be helpful intentions. He assisted her in lifting the heavy scuba tank and BCD combination, positioning it on her back and helping her thread her arms through the straps. His touch lingered longer than necessary as he adjusted the shoulder straps and secured the waist belt. And when he leaned in to check the connections, his breath was warm against her ear as he whispered wishes for a safe and enjoyable dive. But there was something in his touch that felt wrong, a tension in his fingers that spoke of nervousness rather than affection. When Meredith looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her stomach clench with anxiety, though she could not have articulated exactly what troubled her. It was as if he were saying goodbye rather than see you later, and the realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The other divers on the boat were a mix of locals and tourists, ranging from recently certified novices to experienced recreational divers. There was a retired couple from Ohio celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with their first dive vacation, a group of college friends from Atlanta on spring break, and a solo diver from Germany who spoke little English, but whose equipment and confident manner marked him as highly experienced. As the boat approached the dive site, Carlos began his final equipment checks, moving from diver to diver to ensure that all gear was properly secured and functioning. When he reached Meredith, his inspection was cursory, knowing her reputation and expertise. But when he examined her regulator system, something caught his attention, though he said nothing at the time. The mooring buoy marking the wreck site came into view, and Captain Santos maneuvered the boat with practiced skill, using the twin diesel engines to position the vessel precisely over the mooring line. The anchor was deployed, and the boat settled into position with the wreck lying directly beneath them, invisible in the blue-green depths, but mapped with GPS precision. Brandon made a show of double-checking his own equipment, but his movement seemed more for the benefit of observers than for actual safety purposes. He tested his regulator with quick, shallow breaths, rather than the deep inhalations that would reveal any problems with airflow, and his inspection of gauges and connections appeared perfunctory at best. As the divers began their final preparations for entry, Meredith noticed that Brandon had positioned himself to enter the water immediately after her, a departure from their usual practice where she went first to act as guide and safety supervisor. When she mentioned this, he claimed he wanted to stay close to provide protection, though his explanation felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The dive platform was lowered, and Carlos entered the water first to secure the descent line to the mooring buoy and verify that conditions at depth matched the surface forecast. His underwater inspection confirmed excellent visibility and minimal current, perfect conditions for exploring the wreck. He surfaced and gave the all-clear signal, and the divers began their entries one by one. Meredith performed a giant stride entry, stepping off the platform with confidence born of thousands of similar moments. The warm water enveloped her, and she immediately began her surface checks, confirming that her regulator was functioning properly, her mask was sealed, and her BCD was properly inflated for surface swimming. Brandon entered the water immediately behind her, his entry less polished but adequate for the conditions. At the surface, the dive team assembled around the descent line, each diver confirming their readiness with an OK signal to Carlos. The Florida sun was approaching its zenith, creating a dazzling display of light on the water's surface. but beneath them lay a world transformed by the ocean's embrace, where a ship built for war had been reborn as a sanctuary for sea life. As they prepared to descend, Meredith took one last look around at the surface world, not knowing that it would be nearly an hour before she saw sunlight again, and that her survival would depend not on her husband's protection, but on her own preparation, and a secret that she had never shared with anyone, not even the man who had promised to love and protect her, until death did them part. Chapter 2. First Signs. The descent line stretched into the blue depths below like a highway to another world, and the group of 8 divers began their journey downward with the measured pace that marked experienced underwater explorers. At 10 feet below the surface, Meredith paused to equalize the pressure in her ears and sinuses, a process so automatic after years of diving that she barely registered the familiar sensation of her eardrums adjusting to the increasing water pressure. The transformation from the bright surface world to the filtered blue environment of the underwater realm never failed to captivate her, even after more than 1,000 dives. Sunlight penetrated the clear water in shafts of gold and silver, creating a cathedral effect that seemed to sanctify the space around them. Schools of small tropical fish moved in synchronized formations, their silver sides flashing as they turned in unison, while larger predators lurked at the edges of visibility, patient and watchful. Brandon descended beside her, his movements less fluid than hers but adequate for the conditions. She noticed that he seemed unusually focused on her, rather than on the spectacular marine environment around them. His attention fixed on her equipment and her breathing patterns with an intensity that struck her as odd. When she caught his eye and signaled "okay," his response seemed delayed, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. At 20 feet, the group paused for another equalization stop, and Meredith took the opportunity to check her instruments. Her dive computer showed a descent rate within normal parameters, her depth gauge confirmed 20 feet, and her submersible pressure gauge indicated that she still had nearly full tank pressure at 2,900 psi. The readings were exactly what she expected for this point in the dive. Carlos led the group with the confidence of someone who had made this exact dive hundreds of times before, his movements economical and purposeful as he guided the less experienced divers through their first encounter with the wreck. He paused frequently to point out interesting marine life, and to ensure that all members of the group were comfortable with the increasing depth and pressure. As they passed through 30 feet, the water temperature dropped noticeably, and Meredith felt the familiar embrace of the thermocline, the boundary between the sun-warmed surface water and the cooler depths below. Her 3mm wetsuit provided adequate thermal protection for these conditions, but she noticed that some of the other divers seemed to be feeling the chill more acutely. The visibility remained excellent as they continued their descent, with the bottom gradually becoming visible as a vague shadow in the blue distance. At 40 feet, the details of the wreck began to emerge from the depths, like the revelation of a hidden city. The superstructure of the USC GC Duane rose from the sandy bottom with a majesty that never failed to impress, even those who had seen it many times before. Brandon's breathing pattern seemed unusually rapid for the minimal exertion of a controlled descent, and Meredith found herself wondering if he was more nervous about this dive than he had admitted. She had noticed in their previous dives together that he tended to consume air more quickly than other divers with similar experience levels, but today his breathing seemed even more accelerated than usual. At 50 feet, the group reached the superstructure of the wreck, and the full scope of the artificial reef became apparent. The ship's hull stretched away into the gloom on both sides, its metal surfaces completely transformed by more than 30 years of marine growth. Hard and soft corals had colonized every available surface, creating a riot of color and texture that stood in stark contrast to the vessel's original military purpose. Massive Goliath grouper moved slowly through the water around the wreck, their prehistoric appearance lending an air of ancient wisdom to the underwater scene. Smaller fish darted in and out of the ship's openings, treating the wreck as both home and hunting ground. Moray eels peered out from crevices with curious eyes, while schools of yellowtail snapper created living clouds of gold and silver around the divers. Meredith checked her pressure gauge at the 60-foot mark and noted that her air consumption was well within normal parameters for this depth and duration. She had used approximately 400 psi, which was consistent with her usual consumption rate during recreational dives. Her dive computer showed 15 minutes of elapsed time and confirmed their current depth as they continued toward the main deck of the wreck. Brandon swam closer to her than was typical for their usual diving practice, close enough that she could see his eyes behind his mask with unusual clarity. There was something in his expression that she found difficult to interpret, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the routine nature of their dive. When she signaled to ask if he was okay, his response was immediate, but somehow mechanical, as if performed from habit rather than genuine assessment of his condition. The group reached the main deck of the Duane at 80 feet, and Carlos began leading them on a tour of the wreck's most interesting features. The ship's armament had been removed before sinking, but the mounting points for guns and other military equipment were still visible, now serving as attachment points for marine growth and homes for various sea creatures. It was at this point that Meredith noticed something that caused her first real concern of the dive. Her pressure gauge, which should have shown approximately 2400 psi at this depth and time, instead read only 2200 psi. The difference represented a significantly higher rate of air consumption than her experience and conditioning should have produced, especially given the relatively easy swimming conditions and her relaxed state of mind. She double-checked the gauge reading, tapping the face of the instrument gently in case the needle was sticking, but the reading remained constant. A consumption rate this high suggested either equipment malfunction or unusual physiological stress, neither of which she was experiencing consciously. Her breathing felt normal, her exertion level was minimal, and her comfort in the underwater environment was complete. When she signaled to Brandon to show him her pressure reading, his reaction was not what she expected from a concerned diving partner. Instead of showing alarm or suggesting an immediate ascent, he examined the gauge with what appeared to be casual interest, then shrugged and gave her an okay signal that seemed dismissive of her concern. His response was so contrary to established diving safety protocols that she wondered if he had misunderstood the significance of the reading. Standard diving practice dictated that any unusual equipment readings should be taken seriously and investigated immediately, particularly when they suggested abnormally high air consumption that could lead to an out-of-air emergency. Brandon's lack of concern was not only inappropriate but potentially dangerous, especially at their current depth where an emergency ascent could result in decompression sickness or other serious injuries. Carlos led the group deeper into the wreck, passing through a large opening in the superstructure that provided access to what had once been the ship's bridge. The interior spaces of the wreck were cathedral-like in their dimensions, with shafts of filtered sunlight creating an almost spiritual atmosphere. Fish move through these spaces like congregants in an underwater church, their movements slow and reverent. The marine life around the wreck was particularly abundant on this dive, with several species that Meredith had not seen in previous visits to the site. A large nurse shark rested motionlessly on the sand beneath the stern, its breathing gills moving rhythmically as it pumped water over its gill slits. Green moray eels emerged from crevices in the wreck to investigate the passing divers, their serpentine movements graceful and hypnotic. At 90 feet, Meredith checked her air supply again and was disturbed to find that her consumption rate had not improved. The gauge now showed 1,950 psi, representing a consumption of over 1,000 psi in just 20 minutes of diving. At this rate, she would reach the critical reserve level of 500 psi well before the planned bottom time was completed, potentially forcing an early ascent that would disappoint not only herself, but the other divers who were clearly enjoying the spectacular marine life display. More troubling was the fact that her breathing had not felt labored or unusually rapid, suggesting that the high consumption rate was not due to anxiety or overexertion. This pointed toward a possible equipment malfunction, most likely involving the regulator system that controlled the flow of air from her tank to her lungs. Such malfunctions were rare, but potentially catastrophic if they occurred at significant depth, far from the surface and emergency medical care. She attempted to signal her concern to Carlos, who was leading the group through a swim-through in the wreck's superstructure. But the dive guide was focused on navigating the less experienced divers through the confined space, and did not notice her attempts to get his attention. Brandon remained close beside her, but his continued lack of concern about her air consumption readings was beginning to seem not just inappropriate, but suspicious. The group emerged from the swim-through onto the wreck's forward deck, where the remains of the ship's anchor windlass provided a dramatic focal point for underwater photography. Several of the other divers were capturing images of the marine life that had colonized the mechanical equipment, their camera strobes creating brief moments of brilliant illumination in the blue-green environment. At 100 feet, the planned maximum depth for the dive, the full majesty of the artificial reef was revealed. The Duane stretched away in both directions, its hull disappearing into the blue distance like an underwater highway. The sand around the wreck was home to garden eels that swayed in the minimal current like an underwater wheat field, while rays buried themselves in the sediment with only their eyes and breathing spiracles visible. Meredith's dive computer began to beep softly, indicating that they were approaching the no decompression limit for their current depth. Standard procedure would be to begin a slow ascent within the next few minutes to ensure adequate bottom time for decompression stops, without exceeding the safety limits that prevented nitrogen narcosis and other pressure-related problems. But her air consumption remained a serious concern, with her pressure gauge now showing 1,800 psi after 25 minutes of diving. At this rate, she would need to begin her ascent immediately to ensure adequate air for decompression stops and surface swimming, regardless of the planned bottom time for the group. The realization that she might have to abort the dive early was frustrating, but her safety training and professional experience left no room for compromise when it came to air management. When she again attempted to signal her concern to Brandon, his response was even more troubling than his previous dismissal. Instead of showing appropriate concern for her safety, he seemed almost pleased by her predicament, his body language suggesting satisfaction rather than worry. The realization that her husband might actually be happy about her equipment problems sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the water temperature at depth. As the group prepared to explore the ship's stern section, where the propeller and rudder provided some of the wreck's most impressive photographic opportunities, Meredith faced a decision that would determine not only the success of her dive, but possibly her survival. Her training and experience told her to surface immediately, but something about Brandon's behavior suggested that her problems might be more serious than simple equipment malfunction. The pristine underwater environment that had seemed so peaceful and welcoming just minutes before now felt ominous and threatening, transformed by the growing realization that she might be alone in her struggle for survival, abandoned by the very person who had promised to protect her from all harm. The beauty of the artificial reef remained unchanged, but her perception of safety had been shattered by the growing certainty that someone wanted her to run out of air at 100 feet beneath the surface of the ocean. Chapter 3. Critical Point. At 100 feet below the surface, 15 minutes into what should have been a routine exploration of the Duane wreck, Meredith Harris found herself facing a crisis that no amount of training had fully prepared her for. The mechanical failure of life support equipment was one thing, a known risk that every diver accepted and trained to handle. But the growing suspicion that the failure might be intentional added a psychological dimension that was far more terrifying than any equipment malfunction. Her regulator, the critical piece of equipment that controlled the flow of breathing gas from her tank to her lungs, had begun to function erratically. What started as a barely perceptible hesitation in airflow had progressively worsened until each breath required conscious effort and concentration. The regulator's second stage, normally responsive to the slightest inhalation, now seemed to fight against her respiratory efforts, delivering air in uneven bursts that left her feeling constantly short of breath. The symptoms were consistent with a failing demand valve, the mechanism within the regulator that sensed her breathing attempts and delivered the appropriate amount of air. Such failures were extremely rare in modern, well-maintained equipment, but they did occur, usually as a result of contamination, wear, or manufacturing defects. However, the progressive nature of this particular failure seemed almost too convenient, occurring at exactly the depth and time that would create maximum danger. Panic represented the greatest threat to any diver experiencing equipment problems, and Meredith forced herself to employ the mental techniques that had been drilled into her during her instructor training. She slowed her breathing, focused on making each inhalation as efficient as possible, and began a systematic analysis of her situation and options. The methodical approach helped to calm her racing thoughts and allowed her to think clearly about solutions, rather than simply reacting to the crisis. Her submersible pressure gauge now showed 1,400 psi, a reading that would have been cause for concern under normal circumstances, but was approaching critical given her compromised regulator performance. Standard diving protocol called for beginning an ascent when air supply reached 1,000 psi, reserving the final 500 psi for decompression stops and surface swimming. With her current consumption rate and equipment problems, she was rapidly approaching the point of no return. The wreck around her continued to teem with life, oblivious to the human drama playing out in its steel corridors. A massive jewfish moved slowly past her position, its ancient eyes regarding her with the kind of patient wisdom that comes from decades of survival in a hostile environment. Schools of gruntfish moved in perfect synchronization, their collective motion creating living sculptures in the blue-green water. Brandon remained approximately 30 feet away, ostensibly examining a section of the wreck where soft corals had created a particularly colorful display. His positioning kept him close enough to observe her situation, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about her distress signals. When she had attempted to get his attention by tapping her tank with her dive knife, the universal underwater distress signal, he had looked in her direction but made no move to approach or offer assistance. The realization of her husband's true intentions came not as a sudden revelation, but as a growing certainty that crystallized around dozens of small observations and inconsistencies. His insistence on checking her equipment before the dive, his positioning during the descent, his dismissive response to her air consumption concerns, and now his deliberate avoidance of her distress signals all pointed toward a coordinated plan rather than coincidental circumstances. Standard buddy diving protocol required partners to remain within easy swimming distance of each other, typically no more than 10 to 15 feet apart in good visibility conditions. Brandon's current position violated these basic safety rules, placing him far enough away that reaching him would require significant effort and air consumption that she could not afford. His body language suggested casual exploration rather than protective vigilance. Meredith attempted to attract the attention of other divers in the group, but they were scattered across the wreck site, each absorbed in their own exploration of the artificial reef's wonders. Carlos, the dive guide, was approximately 50 feet away, leading two novice divers through a swim-through in the ship's superstructure. The German solo diver was exploring the stern section, while the anniversary couple from Ohio were photographing tropical fish near the bow. Her regulator problems continued to worsen, with airflow becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She found herself having to work harder for each breath, a situation that increased her metabolic demand for oxygen at the same time that her air supply was becoming less reliable. The psychological stress of the situation further increased her oxygen consumption, creating a dangerous spiral that could rapidly lead to unconsciousness or panic. When she attempted to clear the regulator by pressing the purge button, which should have forced a strong flow of air through the system, the response was weak and inconsistent. This confirmed her suspicion that the problem lay within the regulator's internal mechanisms, rather than in the tank valve or high-pressure hose connections. Such internal failures typically required surface repair and could not be fixed underwater. The depth at which her crisis was occurring made the situation exponentially more dangerous than it would have been in shallow water. At 100 feet, the increased ambient pressure meant that any rapid ascent could result in decompression sickness, arterial gas embolism, or other pressure-related injuries that could be fatal, even if she reached the surface alive. The standard emergency ascent rate of 30 feet per minute would require more than 3 minutes, time she might not have given her deteriorating air supply. Brandon finally approached her position, but his demeanor was not that of a concerned partner rushing to provide assistance. Instead, he moved with deliberate casualness, taking time to examine coral formations and fish along the way. When he reached her, his first action was not to offer his backup regulator or check her air supply, but to position himself between her and the other divers, effectively screening their interaction from observation by the rest of the group. The moment when Meredith looked directly into her husband's eyes through his diving mask was when the full horror of her situation became undeniably clear. There was no concern in his expression, no urgency or fear for her safety. Instead, she saw calculation and anticipation, the look of someone waiting for a predetermined outcome rather than someone trying to prevent a tragedy. She made the emergency hand signal for out of air, drawing her finger across her throat in the universal gesture that should have triggered an immediate emergency response from any trained diver. Brandon acknowledged the signal with a nod, indicating that he understood her communication, but his response was to back away rather than move closer to provide assistance. This violation of basic diving safety principles could only be interpreted as intentional abandonment. The physics of her situation were becoming increasingly dire. At 100 feet of depth, her remaining air supply was being consumed at 4 times the rate it would be at the surface due to the increased ambient pressure. Her compromised regulator was forcing her to work harder for each breath, increasing her metabolic demand for oxygen while simultaneously making it more difficult to obtain. The mathematical progression pointed inexorably toward unconsciousness within minutes. Emergency procedures for regulator failure included buddy breathing, emergency swimming ascent, and buoyant emergency ascent. But all of these options required either cooperative assistance from a diving partner or sufficient air supply to reach the surface. Brandon's deliberate non-cooperation eliminated the first option, while her rapidly diminishing air supply made the others increasingly risky. The wreck itself seemed to mock her predicament, its steel bulk representing both sanctuary and trap. The ship's compartments and swim-throughs that had seemed so inviting during the descent now appeared as potential death traps where she could become lost or trapped if her air supply failed completely. The marine life that had provided such beauty and wonder now seemed like witnesses to her impending doom. Her pressure gauge reading had dropped to 900 psi, entering the range where immediate ascent was not just advisable but mandatory. Standard diving practice called for terminating the dive and beginning ascent procedures when air supply reached 1,000 psi, but her equipment problems and Brandon's interference had prevented her from following this protocol. She was now in the critical zone where any delay could prove fatal. The other divers in the group continued their exploration, unaware that one of their number was fighting for survival just meters away. Their peaceful enjoyment of the underwater environment stood in stark contrast to her desperate situation, highlighting how quickly circumstances could change in the underwater world. The same ocean that provided such beauty and tranquility could become a deadly adversary with frightening speed. Brandon's behavior had moved beyond passive non-assistance to active interference with her survival efforts. When she attempted to swim toward Carlos and the other divers, he positioned himself to block her path, using body language that would appear playful to casual observers, but effectively prevented her from seeking help from others. His actions demonstrated a level of premeditation that made her situation even more terrifying. The realization that she was entirely alone in her struggle for survival, abandoned by the person who should have been her primary protector, created a psychological challenge that was almost as dangerous as the physical threat to her life. The betrayal was so complete and unexpected that her mind struggled to accept its reality, even as the evidence became overwhelming and undeniable. At 800 psi remaining air supply and 15 minutes of bottom time at 100 feet depth, Meredith Harris faced the most critical decision of her diving career, and quite possibly her life. Her husband's intentions were now unmistakably clear, her equipment was continuing to fail, and her air supply was approaching the point where survival would require either a miracle or resources that she had not yet revealed to anyone, including the man who was trying to kill her. The pristine underwater environment that surrounded her remained achingly beautiful, indifferent to human drama and tragedy. Schools of fish continued their ancient patterns, coral polyps extended to feed in the current, and the wreck itself stood as a monument to human engineering transformed by natural processes. But for one woman trapped at the bottom of the ocean, this paradise had become a potential tomb, and her survival would depend on secrets she had never shared and preparations she had never mentioned to the man who had promised to love and protect her until death parted them. Chapter 4. Secret Weapon. 15 years of professional diving instruction had taught Meredith Harris that the ocean was an unforgiving environment where the difference between life and death often came down to preparation, redundancy, and the wisdom to plan for scenarios that seemed unlikely until they became reality. Her extensive training and experience had ingrained in her a philosophy that went beyond the basic safety protocols taught to recreational divers. She believed in multiple backup systems for critical life support equipment. The crisis she now faced at 100 feet beneath the surface was exactly the type of situation that had motivated her to carry emergency equipment that went well beyond standard recommendations. While most recreational divers carried only their primary air supply and relied on their buddy for emergency air sharing, Meredith had learned to trust ultimately in her own preparation and equipment, rather than depending entirely on others for survival. Concealed within a specially modified pocket of her buoyancy control device was a piece of equipment that she had carried on every dive for the past 5 years, but had never been forced to use. A 6-liter emergency air supply complete with its own regulator system. The device, commonly known as a pony bottle among technical divers, was small enough to be unobtrusive, but large enough to provide critical breathing gas for emergency ascents from significant depth. The idea of carrying emergency air supplies had come to her after a particularly frightening incident early in her career as an instructor, when a panicked student had grabbed her primary regulator at 60 feet depth, leaving her momentarily without air while she sorted out the emergency. That experience had taught her that even the most careful planning could be disrupted by unpredictable human behavior, and that ultimate responsibility for survival rested with individual preparation rather than group protocols. Her emergency air supply contained approximately 40 cubic feet of breathing gas, enough to sustain her for 5 to 7 minutes at 100 feet depth, or significantly longer if she could begin an immediate ascent toward the surface. The calculation was straightforward. At 4 atmospheres of pressure, her breathing rate would consume roughly 6 cubic feet per minute, giving her sufficient reserves to reach the surface with adequate margin for decompression stops. The pony bottle was equipped with its own first and second stage regulator system, completely independent of her primary life support equipment. This independence was crucial in situations like her current crisis, where the failure of her main regulator could be the result of sabotage affecting multiple components of her primary system. The emergency backup could not be compromised by whatever had caused her main equipment to malfunction. Brandon's position relative to her had shifted slightly as he continued his pretense of casual exploration, but his attention remained focused on her, with the intensity of a predator waiting for prey to weaken. He had moved far enough away to maintain plausible deniability about her distress signals, but close enough to observe the progression of her equipment failure and resulting distress. His behavior pattern suggested familiarity with her normal diving procedures and air consumption rates. Using the Rex structure to shield her actions from Brandon's observation, Meredith carefully reached into the concealed pocket of her BCD and extracted the emergency regulator. The device was compact and lightweight, designed for exactly this type of situation where discretion and rapid deployment were essential. Her movements were deliberate and economical, conserving both energy and precious air from her failing primary system. The first breath from the emergency regulator brought immediate relief, not just from the reliable airflow, but from the psychological comfort of having a functioning life support system. The air was clean and sweet, flowing effortlessly with each inhalation in stark contrast to the labored breathing required by her compromised primary equipment. The difference confirmed her suspicion that her main regulator had been deliberately sabotaged. Her primary air gauge now showed less than 700 psi, a reading that would have sent most recreational divers into panic mode and triggered an immediate emergency ascent. However, Meredith's emergency air supply gave her options that other divers would not have in this situation. She could continue breathing from her backup system while maintaining the appearance of distress from her primary equipment failure. The strategic advantage of her concealed air supply extended beyond mere survival to the realm of evidence gathering and tactical planning. Brandon clearly expected her to panic, attempt a rapid emergency ascent, or lose consciousness from air starvation. His plan, whatever its exact details, depended on her following predictable patterns of distress and emergency response. Her hidden resources allowed her to maintain control while appearing to be helpless. Moving carefully to avoid drawing attention to her changed circumstances, Meredith positioned herself where she could observe Brandon, while remaining partially concealed by the wreck's superstructure. His body language continued to display the relaxed posture of someone engaged in casual exploration, but his frequent glances in her direction revealed his true focus. He was waiting for signs of increasing distress or desperate emergency behavior. The other divers in the group remained scattered across the wreck site, absorbed in their own exploration and unaware of the life and death drama playing out nearby. Carlos was leading 2 novice divers through a swim-through passage, his attention focused on navigation and safety in the confined space. The German technical diver continued his systematic exploration of the stern section, while the anniversary couple photographed colorful sponge formations near the bow. Meredith's dive computer showed that they had been at depth for nearly 20 minutes, approaching the recommended bottom time limits for recreational diving at 100 feet. Under normal circumstances, the dive guide would be preparing to signal the beginning of the group's ascent within the next few minutes. However, her crisis situation had disrupted normal dive protocols and created a time pressure that worked in Brandon's favor. The emergency air supply gave her the breathing gas necessary for survival, but it also provided something even more valuable: time to think and plan her response to Brandon's attempted murder. The psychological pressure of fighting a failing regulator while facing abandonment by her diving partner had been replaced by the calm focus that came from having adequate life support and the element of surprise. Her waterproof action camera, mounted on her diving helmet for the purpose of documenting the marine life around the wreck, had been recording throughout the dive. The device had captured Brandon's suspicious behavior, his dismissive response to her distress signals, and his deliberate positioning to prevent her from seeking help from other divers. This footage would provide crucial evidence of his intentions, assuming she survived to present it. Brandon's knowledge of her diving habits and equipment had clearly informed his sabotage plan, but there were aspects of her preparation that she had never shared with him or anyone else. The emergency air supply was her most closely guarded secret, a piece of equipment that she had purchased independently and maintained without his knowledge. Her philosophy of self-reliance extended to keeping certain survival resources completely private. The technical aspects of her emergency system had been carefully planned to avoid detection, while providing maximum utility in crisis situations. The pony bottle was mounted in a position that would not be visible during routine buddy checks or equipment inspections, and its regulator hose was routed through her BCD in a way that appeared to be part of her primary system. Even experienced divers would not immediately recognize the backup air supply unless they knew specifically what to look for. Her current air consumption from the emergency supply was well within sustainable parameters, giving her sufficient reserves to maintain her position at depth while observing Brandon's behavior and planning her next moves. The mathematical calculations were reassuring. At her current breathing rate and with her available air supply, she had enough breathing gas for at least 15 minutes at 100 feet, more than adequate for documenting evidence and executing a controlled ascent. The wreck environment provided numerous opportunities for concealment and tactical positioning, advantages that Brandon had not anticipated when he selected this location for his murder attempt. The Duane's complex superstructure created visual barriers and hiding places that allowed her to observe his actions while remaining hidden from his view. The marine life and coral formations provided additional camouflage for her movements. Brandon's behavior pattern suggested that he was operating according to a predetermined timeline, expecting her equipment failure to progress to a critical point within a specific time frame. His positioning and attention indicated that he was waiting for her to attempt an emergency ascent or lose consciousness from air starvation. The fact that neither of these events was occurring according to his schedule was clearly making him increasingly anxious. The other divers in the group provided both opportunities and complications for her situation. Their presence meant that any emergency response would have witnesses, making it more difficult for Brandon to claim that her death was purely accidental. However, their scattered positions and focus on their own diving activities meant that they were not immediately available to provide assistance or serve as witnesses to Brandon's behavior. Meredith's professional experience with emergency situations had taught her the importance of controlling the narrative and maintaining documentary evidence of critical events. Her helmet-mounted camera was capturing everything from her perspective, but she needed to ensure that the footage clearly showed Brandon's intentional abandonment and interference with her survival efforts. This required careful positioning and deliberate actions that would be unambiguous in their interpretation. The psychological dimension of her situation was as challenging as the physical threat to her survival. The realization that her husband was actively trying to kill her created an emotional trauma that could easily interfere with clear thinking and rational decision-making. However, her training and experience had prepared her to compartmentalize emotional responses and focus on immediate survival priorities during emergencies. Her emergency regulator continued to function flawlessly, providing the reliable air supply that her primary system had been designed to deliver before Brandon's sabotage. The contrast between the two systems was stark evidence of intentional interference, supporting her growing certainty that her equipment failure was not accidental. The precise nature of the sabotage suggested someone with knowledge of diving equipment and access to her gear. Brandon's familiarity with her diving routines and equipment maintenance schedule had provided him with opportunities to tamper with her life support systems without detection. As her husband and frequent diving companion, he had access to her equipment storage areas and knowledge of her pre-dive inspection procedures. His sabotage had been sophisticated enough to pass her initial equipment checks, while failing progressively during the dive. The timing of the equipment failure, occurring at maximum depth and approximately 15 minutes into the dive, suggested careful calculation of the point at which she would be most vulnerable and least able to seek assistance. The progressive nature of the failure was designed to avoid immediate detection while creating an increasingly desperate situation that would force her into predictable emergency responses. Her position behind a section of the wreck's superstructure provided concealment for her equipment change while offering clear sightlines to observe Brandon's actions. She could see that his attention was focused on her last known position, and his body language suggested increasing agitation as he searched for signs of her distress. His expectation that she should be displaying panic or attempting emergency procedures was clearly not being met. The emergency air supply had transformed her from victim to observer, allowing her to document Brandon's behavior while maintaining the appearance of continued crisis. This strategic deception was crucial for gathering evidence that would survive legal scrutiny and clearly demonstrate his intentional abandonment and interference with her survival efforts. The camera footage would show the stark contrast between appropriate emergency response and his actual behavior. Her dive computer indicated that decompression obligations were beginning to accrue due to their extended time at depth, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. While her emergency air supply was adequate for immediate survival and ascent, the decompression requirements meant that any rapid ascent could result in serious injury even if she reached the surface alive. Brandon's plan may have included forcing her into a desperate emergency ascent that could prove fatal even with adequate air supply. The marine environment around them remained spectacular and peaceful, providing an almost surreal contrast to the human drama of attempted murder playing out among the coral formations and tropical fish. The wreck continued to serve its purpose as an artificial reef, supporting countless species of marine life that had made their homes in the vessel's steel structure. For them, this was simply another day in their underwater paradise. Meredith's breathing remained calm and controlled as she drew life-sustaining air from her secret reserve, each breath bringing not just oxygen, but the strength and clarity needed to survive her husband's betrayal. The equipment that he did not know she possessed had become her salvation, and the preparation that she had never discussed had provided her with options that he could not have anticipated. In the blue depths of the Florida Keys, surrounded by the beauty and danger of the ocean depths, she prepared to turn the tables on the man who had promised to love and protect her, but had instead chosen to become her would-be killer. Chapter 5. Underwater Revelation. Drawing steady, life-sustaining breaths from her concealed emergency air supply, Meredith positioned herself strategically behind a section of the Duane's Bridge superstructure, where coral growth provided additional visual screening. Her helmet-mounted camera continued recording, capturing crucial evidence while she prepared to document the full extent of Brandon's murderous intentions through deliberate provocation of his revealing behavior. The psychology of her situation had shifted dramatically with the security provided by her backup air supply. No longer fighting for each breath or calculating minutes until unconsciousness, she could now focus on the tactical aspects of survival and evidence gathering. Brandon's plan depended on her following predictable patterns of panic and desperation, but her hidden resources allowed her to control the timing and nature of her responses. Her primary regulator continued to function poorly, delivering air in irregular bursts that would have been terrifying without her backup system. The sabotage had been expertly executed, creating a progressive failure that would appear accidental to casual investigation, while being severe enough to cause death through air starvation or panic-induced rapid ascent. The technical sophistication suggested premeditation and research into diving equipment vulnerabilities. Brandon's position had shifted closer to her last known location, his movements showing increased urgency as he searched for signs of her expected distress. His body language displayed the tension of someone whose carefully planned scenario was not unfolding according to schedule. The absence of panic or emergency ascent attempts from her position was clearly causing him concern about the effectiveness of his sabotage. Using her emergency regulator to maintain normal breathing patterns, Meredith began to simulate the progressive stages of air starvation that Brandon expected to observe. She allowed her movements to become slightly more erratic, checked her pressure gauge with exaggerated frequency, and began swimming in patterns that suggested growing desperation and confusion. The performance was calculated to draw him closer, while appearing authentic to the recording camera. Her acting drew the desired response as Brandon approached her position with what appeared to be helpful concern, but moved with the calculated precision of someone following a predetermined script. When he reached her, his first actions were not those of a trained diver responding to an emergency, but rather someone positioning himself to better observe and potentially control the outcome of her crisis. The critical moment came when Meredith made the universal distress signal for air emergency, drawing her finger across her throat while pointing to her pressure gauge, which now showed less than 500 psi. Any properly trained diving partner should have immediately offered their backup regulator and initiated emergency ascent procedures. Brandon's response revealed the true nature of his intentions. Instead of providing immediate assistance, Brandon examined her gauge with apparent concern, but made no move to offer his backup regulator or signal for help from other divers. His delay in responding to a clear emergency could only be interpreted as intentional, especially given his training and the unambiguous nature of her distress signals. The camera captured every moment of his inappropriate response. When she attempted to swim toward other members of the diving group to seek assistance, Brandon's behavior became overtly obstructive. He positioned himself to block her path while maintaining the appearance of trying to help, using body language that would seem protective to casual observers, but effectively prevented her from reaching others who could provide aid. His actions demonstrated clear intent to isolate her during the emergency. The most damning evidence came when Brandon actually grasped her arm and began guiding her away from the main group and deeper into the wreck's interior spaces. Under the guise of finding a sheltered area to address her equipment problems, he was actually moving her to a location where her death would be less likely to be witnessed by other divers. The camera angle captured both his actions and the direction he was leading her. Recognizing that she had documented sufficient evidence of his criminal intent, Meredith decided to escalate her performance to force even more revealing behavior. She allowed herself to appear to lose consciousness, letting her body go limp in the water while secretly maintaining control of her breathing through the concealed emergency regulator. The simulation was designed to trigger Brandon's final actions. Her feigned unconsciousness produced exactly the response she had anticipated. Rather than immediately attempting rescue breathing or emergency ascent procedures, Brandon released his grip on her and moved back to a position where he could observe her apparent drowning without being implicated in direct action. His behavior was that of someone waiting for a death, rather than someone trying to prevent one. The underwater communication system crackled with Carlos's voice as the dive guide began his routine check of all group members' positions and status. This interruption forced Brandon to shift his behavior abruptly, transforming from passive observer of her apparent death to frantic would-be rescuer calling for assistance. His acting was convincing, but came too late to disguise his previous actions from the camera record. Brandon's emergency signals to Carlos were performed with theatrical desperation, pointing toward Meredith's apparently unconscious form, while displaying body language that suggested panic and helplessness. His transformation from calculated observer to desperate husband was dramatic, but ultimately served to highlight the contrast in his behavior before and after the arrival of witnesses. The response from Carlos and 2 other experienced divers was immediate and professional, demonstrating the stark difference between appropriate emergency response and Brandon's previous inaction. Their rapid approach and coordinated rescue efforts provided a clear comparison that would be invaluable in any subsequent investigation of the incident. As the rescue divers approached her position, Meredith prepared for the final phase of her deception. She had gathered extensive evidence of Brandon's murderous intent, but now needed to return to the surface alive to ensure that the evidence could be presented and acted upon. Her emergency ascent needed to appear miraculous rather than planned. The timing of her recovery had to appear natural and coincidental rather than controlled and deliberate. She waited until the rescue divers were close enough to witness her apparent return to consciousness, then activated her buoyancy control device to initiate what would appear to be an instinctive emergency ascent by a panicked, air-starved diver who had suddenly regained awareness. Her emergency ascent was controlled, despite appearing desperate, following proper ascent rates and decompression procedures while maintaining the appearance of a terrified diver fleeing toward the surface. The performance required precise calculation to appear authentic, while avoiding actual decompression injuries that could compromise her ability to testify against Brandon. Breaking through the surface of the ocean felt like emerging from a nightmare into reality, though Meredith knew that her real challenges were just beginning. The evidence she had gathered underwater would need to be preserved and presented in a way that would convince authorities of Brandon's guilt, while avoiding any suggestion that she had deliberately placed herself in danger to gather that evidence. The response from the boat crew was immediate and professional, with emergency oxygen and first aid equipment deployed before she had even reached the dive platform. Their genuine concern and expert care provided another stark contrast to Brandon's underwater behavior, highlighting the difference between appropriate emergency response and intentional abandonment. Brandon's surface performance as the distraught husband was as convincing as his underwater acting had been calculated and cold. He held her hand, expressed concern for her condition, and recounted his version of events in a way that portrayed him as a helpless witness to equipment failure, rather than the architect of attempted murder. His ability to shift between roles was chilling in its implications, but the camera had captured everything, and the evidence was secure in waterproof digital storage that would survive any attempt at tampering or destruction. The footage showed clearly that Brandon had not only failed to provide appropriate emergency assistance, but had actively interfered with her survival efforts and positioned himself to observe her death without being directly implicated. As medical oxygen flowed into her lungs and warm blankets surrounded her body, Meredith began planning the next phase of her survival strategy. The underwater ordeal was over, but the legal and personal challenges of proving attempted murder by someone who appeared to be a loving, concerned husband were just beginning. The ocean had tested her diving skills and emergency preparedness, but the surface world would test her courage and determination in ways that were potentially even more dangerous. The evidence existed, documented in high-definition digital video that captured every moment of Brandon's betrayal and attempted murder. Now, she needed to ensure that evidence reached the proper authorities and that justice was served for the man who had promised to love and protect her, but had instead tried to kill her in the depths of the Florida Keys, 100 feet beneath the surface of the sea that had become both her near grave and her salvation. Chapter 6. Surface Justice. The dive boat's emergency protocols swung into full operation as Meredith was brought aboard, though her condition was far better than her performance suggested. The boat's crew, trained in dive emergency procedures, immediately provided supplemental oxygen and began monitoring her vital signs while preparing for potential medical evacuation to the nearest hyperbaric chamber facility. Their professional response stood in stark contrast to the calculated negligence she had experienced from her husband at depth. Captain Santos radioed the Coast Guard to report a diving emergency and request standby assistance, while crew members established communication with Divers Alert Network to coordinate potential emergency medical care. The response was swift and professional, demonstrating the kind of coordinated emergency support that existed for diving accidents, making Brandon's underwater abandonment even more inexcusable and criminal. Brandon's performance as the concerned husband continued with Academy Award-caliber conviction, his face displaying exactly the right mixture of relief, concern, and residual fear that would be expected from someone whose spouse had just survived a near-fatal diving accident. He held her hand with apparent tenderness, repeatedly asked about her condition, and provided what seemed like helpful details about the emergency to the boat's crew. His narrative of events was carefully constructed to present himself in the most favorable light, while subtly shifting responsibility for the emergency to equipment failure and unfortunate circumstances. He described his efforts to help her, his concern when he realized she was in distress, and his immediate attempts to summon assistance when the situation became critical. The story was plausible and designed to deflect any suspicion of wrongdoing. Carlos conducted a preliminary examination of Meredith's diving equipment while she received medical attention, his experienced eye immediately identifying the problems with her regulator system that had caused the life-threatening emergency. What he discovered was deeply troubling. Clear evidence of deliberate sabotage that went far beyond simple equipment failure or maintenance negligence. The regulator's diaphragm showed multiple small cuts that appeared to have been made with a sharp blade, creating precisely the kind of progressive failure that Meredith had experienced underwater. The cuts were too regular and systematic to be accidental damage, and their location was exactly where they would cause maximum problems while being difficult to detect during routine pre-dive equipment checks. Additional examination revealed that the regulator's internal mechanisms had been subtly altered in ways that would cause increasing airflow restriction under pressure, explaining why the problems had not manifested during surface testing, but had become critical at depth. The sophistication of the sabotage indicated knowledge of diving equipment design and familiarity with the specific model of regulator that Meredith used. Carlos shared his findings with Captain Santos, who immediately secured the equipment as potential evidence and documented its condition with digital photography. Their actions were based on years of experience with diving accidents, and an understanding that equipment failures of this nature were extremely rare and usually indicative of more serious problems than simple mechanical malfunction. The boat's emergency medical supplies included recording equipment for documenting patient condition and treatment, and this equipment captured Meredith's apparent recovery and her initial statements about the diving emergency. Her account of events was carefully constructed to appear consistent with the trauma of near-death experience, while avoiding any direct accusations that could not be supported by the evidence she had gathered. Brandon's relief at her apparent survival was mixed with subtle signs of disappointment and concern that suggested his plan had not unfolded as intended. His questions about her memory of events and her condition seemed designed to assess whether she suspected his involvement, rather than expressing genuine concern for her well-being. The contrast between his public performance and private concerns was evident to trained observers. The return journey to the marina provided time for initial statements and preliminary investigation of the incident, with Captain Santos conducting interviews with all members of the diving group to establish a timeline of events and gather witness testimony. The process was routine for diving accidents, but took on additional significance given the suspicious nature of the equipment failure. Other divers in the group reported that they had been unaware of any emergency until Carlos announced the need for immediate assistance, highlighting how isolated Meredith had been during her crisis and supporting her account of being unable to attract help from anyone except her diving partner. Their testimony would prove crucial in establishing the circumstances surrounding Brandon's failure to provide appropriate assistance. Back at the marina, paramedics conducted a thorough evaluation of Meredith's condition and recommended precautionary observation at the local hospital to rule out any delayed effects of the diving emergency. The medical evaluation provided additional documentation of her condition and created an official record of the incident that would be valuable in any subsequent investigation. During the medical evaluation, Meredith carefully preserved the memory card from her helmet-mounted camera, ensuring that the critical evidence of Brandon's behavior would be secure and admissible in legal proceedings. The footage represented the most important evidence of his criminal intent and would be essential for proving that her near-death experience was the result of attempted murder rather than accident. Brandon accompanied her to the hospital, maintaining his role as the devoted husband throughout the medical evaluation and treatment process. His performance was flawless, expressing exactly the right levels of concern, relief, and support that would be expected in such circumstances. However, his private moments revealed subtle signs of tension and calculation that suggested his mind was focused on damage control rather than her recovery. The hospital's standard procedures for diving emergencies included detailed documentation of the incident and preservation of any evidence that might be relevant to potential investigations or insurance claims. The medical staff's professional handling of these procedures ensured that all evidence would be properly maintained and that official records would accurately reflect the circumstances of her emergency. Late that evening, alone in her hotel room while Brandon made phone calls to their insurance company and dive equipment manufacturer, Meredith finally reviewed the footage from her underwater camera. The digital evidence was even more damning than she had hoped, clearly showing Brandon's calculated abandonment and active interference with her survival efforts. The video record began with normal diving activities, but progressively documented her equipment problems, her distress signals, Brandon's inappropriate responses, and his ultimately criminal behavior in leading her away from potential help while refusing to provide emergency assistance. The footage was unambiguous in its depiction of intentional abandonment and attempted murder. The technical quality of the video was excellent, with clear images and audio that would be admissible as evidence in criminal proceedings. The camera's metadata provided timestamps and depth information that corroborated her account of events and established a precise timeline of Brandon's actions. The evidence was comprehensive and virtually impossible to dispute or explain away. Her decision to contact law enforcement was made easier by the existence of the video evidence, but she knew that accusing her husband of attempted murder would require careful planning and coordination with authorities who had experience in complex criminal cases. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office had jurisdiction over the incident, and their Maritime Crimes Unit had extensive experience with diving-related investigations. Detective Sarah Johnson was assigned to the case and immediately recognized the serious nature of the allegations and evidence. Her background in criminal investigation and familiarity with diving accidents allowed her to quickly assess the significance of the video footage and the technical evidence from the sabotaged equipment. Her response was professional and thorough. The investigation expanded rapidly to include financial analysis of the couple's accounts, examination of insurance policies, and detailed forensic analysis of the diving equipment. Each element of the investigation supported Meredith's account of attempted murder and revealed the extensive planning that had gone into Brandon's scheme. Brandon's financial records revealed significant debts and questionable investments that had created desperate circumstances requiring immediate access to large amounts of cash. The $2 million life insurance policy on Meredith's life represented the solution to his financial problems, providing both motive and method for the attempted murder. Forensic analysis of tools found in Brandon's garage revealed microscopic traces of rubber, consistent with the diving equipment that had been sabotaged, providing physical evidence linking him directly to the tampering. The scientific evidence, combined with the video documentation and financial motive, created an overwhelming case for premeditated attempted murder. The arrest came 3 days after the diving incident, as Brandon was preparing for what he claimed would be a romantic dinner to celebrate Meredith's survival. The timing was deliberate, designed to catch him off guard and prevent any opportunity to destroy evidence or flee the jurisdiction. His shock at being charged with attempted murder was genuine, suggesting he had believed his plan was foolproof. The trial that followed attracted national attention as a case study in domestic violence and the lengths to which financial desperation could drive someone to betray their most fundamental relationships. The video evidence was compelling, the forensic evidence was conclusive, and the financial motive was clear and documented. Brandon's conviction on charges of attempted murder in the first degree resulted in a sentence of 25 years to life in prison, without possibility of parole. The judge's comments during sentencing emphasized the particularly heinous nature of the crime, noting the calculated planning, the exploitation of trust, and the callous disregard for human life that the evidence had revealed. Meredith's survival and successful prosecution of her would-be killer became legendary within the diving community, serving as both a cautionary tale about the importance of equipment redundancy and a reminder that danger could come from the most unexpected sources. Her story was incorporated into diving safety courses as an example of how proper preparation and emergency equipment could mean the difference between life and death. She returned to her career as a diving instructor with renewed purpose, using her experience to emphasize the critical importance of backup life support systems and independent safety planning. Her students learned not only the technical skills of diving, but also the psychological preparation necessary for survival in situations where help might not come from expected sources. The incident had transformed her understanding of both diving safety and human nature, teaching her that the greatest threats to survival might come not from equipment failure or environmental hazards, but from the betrayal of trust by those closest to her. The lesson was harsh, but ultimately empowering, demonstrating that proper preparation and self-reliance could overcome even the most calculated attempts at murder. The clear waters off Key Largo continued to attract divers from around the world, and the Duane Wreck remained one of the most popular diving destinations in the Florida Keys. But for those familiar with Meredith's story, the site carried additional significance as the place where preparation, courage, and a secret air supply had prevented a perfect murder and brought a would-be killer to justice.